Hello and welcome to the Knowing Show. I am your host, Christine Marie, and I am excited to be here with you all today. I am excited to talk about some actually nuanced topics. There's a lot on my heart and on my mind as we dive in today. So I'm day 3 in on the Knowing Intensive. Have been working with a founder here on the west coast of the country, and we've been doing a deep dive over the last. It'll be a total of 72 hours, and it's been intense. It's been hard, and y'all, it's interesting because today. So that's number one. We've been doing a deep dive, running through the Knowing Intensive, and today we're going to be talking about some additional practices that we've been incorporating during our time together that has been really beneficial for him, but then also that's just been so incredibly beneficial for me and others who have attended the Knowing retreats in the past. So we're going to be talking about that. The second thing that we're going to be unpacking is today marks what would have been 12 years of my wedding anniversary. And so there's obviously a lot there that I've been thinking about and kind of musing over in my own personal vertical alignment this morning before diving into the Knowing Founder Intensive today. So those two topics are going to kind of be the foundation guiding us here for the next little bit. One of the things that I've really been sitting with this morning in my own vertical alignment, and then with this Knowing, with this founder over the last couple of days during this Knowing Intensive, has been really delving into, well, who are you? What is the baseline of effectively your life today as you know it? And what is the baseline in each category of your life? So really diving into the baseline of their approach, their relationship with finances, looking at it from the lens of what does it look like with your family? What does it look like on the relationship side with friends? And then also, what does it look like professionally? How are you showing up as a leader and establishing that baseline? I worked with a coach who was the performance coach for Lance Armstrong and a bunch of other athletic performers. And I guess you could say proteges. He's worked with so many, and he's just such an incredible, talented coach. And so he was working with me, and the way that he effectively positioned it was talking about the goal positioning survey, taking a full-blown analysis of where are we starting today, so that understanding of the baseline, now we're like lined up. Now the gunshot fires and now we go. But apart from doing that analysis, apart from doing the deep dive and really understanding where am I starting from, then there's going to be no way to really track and measure success from here on out. Likewise, we need to understand where we started from at the very beginning, before we even came to the point today. That's where the Knowing framework really comes into play, which is the answering and delving into these 3 questions. Who was I? What was my initial starting point in life? Who am I today? What's my starting point now? And then who do I want to be? Where's the end target? Where do I want to end up? But we have to take stock of the first of what even is the genesis? Where did I even start? Because otherwise we can't help it. We're always looking to have, honestly, it's a measuring stick, like how am I doing against, and if we're not measuring against ourselves, we cannot help but measure against other people. Others will be our guiding posts, and others will be effectively, I actually wrote this article for Digital Marketer a couple years ago, and I was talking about the 3 C's: competitors, customers, and effectively what was the third one? It was, colleagues. If we're not clear on what our goals are, on allowing for us to be our own guideposts, in terms of what do I want and then where have I traveled from, we're constantly going to be outsourcing that to those around us, whether it's the competition, whether it's our own colleagues, whether it's our customers, and other people will effectively be the ones in the driver's seat unless we take with intention ownership over here's where I started, here's where I am today, and then here's where I want to go. Without doing that, we're going to be looking up and around at everyone around us rather than being able to effectively function with blinders on, knowing this is where I came from and where I started, this is where I am today, and then this is where I'm going. I think of it like horses with blinders. It really, really keeps them focused because there's so much distraction. And so as I was this morning during my own vertical alignment practice, I was really kind of looking at 12 years, 12 years since I got married in August 31st, 2013 versus today, August 31st, 2025, and really doing an analysis of, man, look at where I started at 20 years old and looking at little Christene. And there's a lot of compassion. I talked about compassion yesterday. Y'all, compassion is so incredibly important. Compassion is empathy with action. It's the simplest way to define it. It's feeling the emotional care and love and putting ourselves in the position. Usually we think of empathy for someone else, so it's putting ourselves in the position of someone else, sitting alongside them, looking at the world through their lens and really understanding on an emotional level how they feel in that moment in time as they experience the world. But man, do we rarely take time to show empathy for our own selves. And so that's part one of compassion is allowing empathy, whether it's for someone else or for ourselves. And then two, it's action. It's not just sitting in the experience. It's taking real steps to allow for change, to allow for healing, to allow for growth, changing what is the status quo. Because if we really are moved so much with that empathy, with that emotional tenderness for the other person or for ourselves, it doesn't matter who. If we're truly moved, then we cannot help but act. We cannot help but move into action. And so with this whole concept of compassion towards ourselves, we then, in taking stock of, here's where I am today, here's where I was at kind of the starting point, there's just so much grace then that propels us forward. There's a tenderness that moves us to take action against what our goal is and where we want to go. And so as I was taking a look at this 20-year-old girl, I felt that compassion. And it was the empathy, but then also the action. How do I ensure that I don't end up repeating old patterns of behavior? How do I make sure that I don't end up being that blind, naive girl that I was? And y'all, this is where the tenderness is so important, because if we are not allowing the empathy and we're simply using kind of an action-oriented mindset as we look at the past, we cannot help but judge. So it is the empathy in concert with action that protects us from having such a harsh judge and master over our own selves, and then allowing us to thus change, but it's propelled from this place of empathy. And it also, when it is extended to ourselves, when compassion is ultimately the foundation from which we operate, we sit and look at ourselves, we make real changes from this place, we cannot help but then extend it to others. So if we're judging things in ourselves, the natural modus operandi is going to be judging others. And likewise, if we're extending compassion to ourselves, compassion will thus be the kind of natural overflow. That which is within us cannot help but overflow into the outer world. And so as I've been taking stock, Joe Ingram, I just saw your comment. Joe, I'm glad we have matching necklaces. So I just saw your comment on Instagram. That's so funny. Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here. As I was taking stock over, these 12 years since I got married, and then really looking at, okay, these were the mindsets. So this whole concept of who was I, who am I, and who do I want to be within the knowing framework, these three questions, they allow for us, coupled with compassion, they allow for us to, again, extend empathy, look through the world at that time in our lives, and then see, okay, this is actually really what wasn't serving me. And so as I look back, I actually look back on my 8.5 years of being married with so much pride. The topic for today, ultimately the title for it, is what is the legacy that we're creating for ourselves? And so when we look back at these points in our lives and we're like, how in the world, hindsight's always 20/20. How in the world did I make that decision back then, 20 years old? Why was it a good idea to be a child bride? It's so easy to extend judgment, yet empathy allows for me to hold a tenderness, to truly be curious and understand why I thought that was a good idea. And then it allows for me to also then enact real wisdom to then say, okay, well, how do I protect myself from making a similar judgment call today? So as I look back, I'm really honestly quite proud of the character qualities that I exhibited throughout my tenure being married. But then there was also a lot of weaknesses that I see now looking back. And now with compassion, with the lens of compassion, I can see extend empathy to this young woman who really did the best she knew how, but then also identify all these areas of weakness that I now can take real action upon and thus change. And so over the last 3.5 years, I've really been changing so much as I've looked in the mirror, as I've come to know those different parts of my life, so that now as I examine who am I today, I have a real action plan so that I don't end up repeating history. Without clear targets, we're going to end up doing a 360 rather than a 180 and moving in a linear direction. We're going to make a big old loop. And so as I've been sitting with this founder during our Knowing Intensive over the last few days, we've really been diving into this progression of, well, okay, who were you? What were those core stories and narratives in childhood that really shaped your lens through which you viewed the world? Okay, now let's go back with empathy and allow for us to really understand what were those experiences, but then also with action. So ultimately, compassion is kind of like that guardrail for us, going to the past, revisiting it, coming up with a real action plan to ensure that, okay, today, as we examine how your narratives, how those old stories have real hold over you today in the present, in terms of who are you, really analyzing that. How do those mindsets manifest today? Okay, now what's the action plan to get you to where you want to be? And so as we were working together, we entered our time together with the dream and goal of identifying what is the thing that he's going to spend the next half of his life on. He's had a number of successful exits and has come to a point where he's like, all right, I'm ready for the next thing. But in order for him to be the person that can accomplish those next things, he has actually some healing work to do, just like how I've had to as well. So I've come into this awareness of, okay, this is my mission. My mission is helping people understand emotional intelligence, glean and garner emotional health to heal from the past, and then ultimately to be able to then turn to those around them and operate in this kind of new dynamic, a brand new generational pattern effectively, which is so incredibly difficult. And y'all, that's a whole other reason, the conversation around generational patterns, us analyzing, well, okay, this is actually the environment in which I was raised. Guys, we have to look back with so much compassion, because we're trying to change something really big here. Me today, looking back from where I came, which was effectively no semblance of emotional intelligence at all, no other real honoring for anything other than the intellect, which is what was cultivated in schools, and then the spirit, which was, my family was very heavily Christian conservative. And so those were the only two parts of me that were really cultivated. And even the intellect itself, in our family, the hierarchical structure was spiritual intelligence was like the most important thing. And even then, it wasn't necessarily spiritual intelligence. It was more so spiritual verbatim. Like we could speak and recall what was told to us, and we could regurgitate things, but it wasn't like we were actually being taught through revelation for ourselves. And so with this whole topic of creating our own legacy, we have to go back and do the work in order for us to then be free to create something new and thus walk in something new. We have to be new ourselves. But for us to be new, we have to go back and understand what has preceded from this point in time, what has happened, what has taken place. Okay, now let me be informed to then make real change, so I don't do the 360 repetition of history, but I make a 180 change. And in this process, y'all, there is so much freedom. There's so much excitement as we start moving into this new. It's almost like this new realm of possibility, because we're now no longer operating on default on autopilot. We're literally every single day, yes, there might be a new habit or a new frame in which I operate to eat, sleep, wake up, have my meal prep, the normal elements of life. But if I'm constantly moving towards a new ideal, which is relatively unknown, and I'm constantly moving up and moving in a lateral position rather than repeating myself and repeating history, it's always new. It's always exciting. And thus I will never be bored. And how cool is that? Is that every single day we're creating a new life for ourselves. And if we think about it, we're not repeating the same day because, and it's so simple when I say this, you know, even as I say it, I kind of chuckle a little bit. It makes me laugh. And it's still true. There is no other August 31st, 2025 than today. And so am I treating today with the honor that it deserves? Am I treating myself with the honor that I deserve? I was in this time of actually prayer this morning, and I just felt like God told me, you know, this whole concept of honoring ourselves. Am I able to look back on today with a pride and with a holding my head held high over how I treated my physical body, my intellect, my emotions, every part of me? Am I proud of how I engage with myself? And what's so interesting in that is that, man, when we think about creating legacy, frankly, I've always thought of it as, what are other people going to say? Even when I wrote my own eulogy, it was like, what do I want other people to say about me? But y'all, have we and do we regularly take stock of, well, am I proud of the way that I show up? Am I proud of how I live my life? And so when I look back on, you know, today marks 12 years of what would have been my anniversary with my former husband. Am I proud of that woman who was married for 8.5 years, almost a decade? You know, she gave so much of her life, the majority of her 20s to this man. Am I proud of who that woman was? And honestly, I look back and I'm so proud. I feel like I honor that woman, even though there was so much that I needed to learn, even though there was so much that I needed to grow and change. And that is why we have to look back on ourselves, on our lives, the place from which we started with compassion so that we can respect and honor who we were and extend empathy, and then take real action today to ensure that we don't repeat history. Although I will say, the looking back with empathy does not automatically mean that we'll honor that person. That honor is reserved for only when we're operating within the confines of our own established hierarchical structure of values and our own ideal. So if we haven't done the work to create that, there's no way for us to be able to really, truly extend honor towards ourselves today. And even have a baseline for, am I even operating in a guise or within the bounds of what I would deem honorable? So then the question becomes, well, what is honor for you and me? What deems an honorable person versus a dishonorable person? And this is such an important question, because it's not whether that person is worthy. You know, it's a question about their innateness of being a worthy human being of love or belonging, let's say. But are they worthy of honor? And honor, I want to look this up really fast, because there's something about honor that we don't talk too much about. And I want to look at the Greek meaning of this word honor, because I know that there's so much more here. There's value. And you know what I love here too is that the verb form, it says, means to assign value, respect, or reverence to someone or something. And reverence, man, isn't that a powerful word? Do we revere the manner in which we are living our lives? And that is like, even as I say that, that's so heavy, that question. Do I revere how I am spending my time? And I'm going to be sitting with that one, because I know, man, if I really, really revered time, if I really revered recognizing I only have today, how much more differently would I live? If I really revered this physical body, I probably wouldn't eat some of the things that I eat. I would actually intentionally avoid certain things because I have a reverence for this physical body, for my soul, for my spirit. And then this question of reverence, it's not just how am I spending my time, but what are the inputs? What am I allowing to feed and nourish my soul, my spirit, my mind, my body? You know, that question becomes so much more broad when now we think of honor as reverence. And y'all, this is the question, man. It's, yes, what's the legacy I'm leaving behind? What are people going to say about me? But what am I going to say about me? What do I say about me now? If I was to take a true, honest assessment of my life, of my week, of my month, of my year, do I hold a reverence and a true honor around how I spend my time, around the inputs that are nourishing me? And even I think the question should extend to, do I hold a reverence to those 5 people closest to me? We all know that famous quote of, you are the sum of the 5 people you spend time with. So then the question is, okay, beyond me, do I hold a reverence for those 5 people? Because they're all inputs, they're all informing my time. And so if I want to be radically responsible and thus live differently, I think, y'all, we have to answer this question at the end of the day. Do I want to see change in my life? And the answer might be no. And I actually think that that's really important for us to recognize, because if the answer is no, there's kind of like oh, well, golly, gee whiz, let me just stay where I am. And you know what? There are times in our life where we are operating in survival. I feel a little bit emotional right now, because this morning I read a post that I shared 3 years ago on this date. It was 1 year, about, I guess, 6 months after my husband and I officially signed divorce papers, 1 year after he left. And it was the first real public sharing about my life falling apart. And y'all, I really was just living in survival at that time, or kind of leading up to that time. My post actually was about moving out of survival and effectively choosing, I actually want something more than just getting by day to day. But there are times where we just can be so proud of, I am so grateful that I made it through today. Another time in my life where it was truly survival was when my brother-in-law was killed, and my sister and her 3-week-old baby girl were living with us, and it was just a living hell. It was we were all just in like this depth in this swamp of grief. And there was no time, there was no desire to go existential and say, oh, well, how do I want to change? How do I want to better myself? In fact, that was when I went and contended with God and was like, said some words that are not appropriate for public streaming. Y'all, there are times where it's just survival. And frankly, I think that those actually warrant real reverence as well. Because looking back, I know, like, that's where I actually felt that pit in my stomach as I was remembering where I was. I remember exactly where I was when I wrote that post 3 years ago, and just feeling that depth of pain. And y'all, the thing that's so important, and I told this to the founder today as we were in our Knowing Intensive, no one else knows that depth of pain but you. Even if you and your partner, or you and me and my sister went through a loss, it's never going to be exactly comparable, because they don't have your experience, they don't have your backstory, they don't have your soul. So we have to go in and come to know every part of us in order to even honor that experience. Like, going back, me today, I went back and I kind of visualized where I was, and man, I was in so much pain during that time. And there was a reverence and there was an honor to go back to that girl. At the time, I was 28 years old. And I'm so proud of that Christene, how she handled that amount of loss, how she handled her future breaking and falling apart. And then looking back at 20-year-old Christene, who gets married as a child bride, and really doing the best I knew how. And that doesn't mean that there's not room to grow. And that does not mean that we don't look back, yes, with tenderness, yes, with empathy, but gleaning, like honestly, it's so beautiful if we kind of go back. Oh, this is such a fun analogy. If we go back to times in our lives and we go in with compassion, which is empathy and action working in concert with each other, and we allow for the tenderness, and we allow for the curiosity, and we allow for the love, it's almost like now we're able to pick. It's almost like that we're harvesting. We're picking the lessons that we learned from that time, and we're picking the fruits from the harvest. We did the work during that time. And like they say, hindsight's always 20/20. To go back, we then harvest the lessons we learned to then take them with us today. But if we never go back, we actually we miss out on the harvest. We missed out on, well, that was so painful. I had this thought come to mind when my husband first left. I was like, I want to squeeze every ounce of lesson, of learning, of effectively making and alchemizing that degree of pain that was just so awful. I don't want to miss a single ounce of it. And so this whole concept of, I was thinking at that time of the analogy of like, I want to squeeze it like a lemon press. Like I just want to squeeze all of that I possibly can from that pain. That's in real time. That's in the moment. But now in hindsight, I can retroactively go back and see, oh man, what are the other things that were kind of gestating and percolating under the surface? Because frankly, when you're so in it, it's hard to really come up for air and see a different perspective. So to be able to go back, it is reaping the harvest. It's picking the fruit and plucking the flowers and taking the harvest and looking at it and being like, wow, I gleaned so much from that season when my husband first left in that early stage after the divorce, where it was just so devastating, but I can still go back and learn even more. And so as I went back for my own experience today, as it's, the 12-year anniversary of what would have been the 12-year anniversary. And then also doing so with the founder throughout this Knowing Intensive, we're gleaning and harvesting so much good fruit to then take into this next season. And so as we move forward, whether it's me, as I look ahead at, okay, what did I learn during that time for this founder as he looks back over his life and then is plotting the next course for his next latter half of his life, really identifying who do we need to become in order to then step into this role. There was a number of months actually where I felt like in my time of vertical alignment, I really felt like God was telling me to read James 1. And in James 1, there's this verse that says, and James 1 is a book of the Bible. And James 1 has this verse that says, actually, I'm going to look it up. There's a verse, I think it's James 1, verse 2. It says, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And I just felt like God kept bringing me back to that verse. And I was like, why? Like, okay, what's here for me? I keep rereading it again, but I feel like I'm not really getting anything new. So I decided to look up the Greek word of the word trial. And when I did, I had this realization. I was like, oh my gosh, that word trial is effectively akin. It's the same word that Viktor Frankl, and the author of Man's Search for Meaning, the man who was in Auschwitz for so long in these concentration camps, lost his wife, just lost every bit of what we would classify as human dignity. He lost everything. And he says between stimulus and response is choice. And what I realized in reading this verse, to consider it joy whenever we experience trials, I was like, okay, I hear people say that, but what does that really mean? And y'all, this is where, when I talk about don't outsource truth, but go inward for divine revelation, this is what I mean. Really leaning into not just, okay, this is what everyone else says, whether it's those 3 C's I was talking about earlier, having other people be the baseline, the customer, the colleague, the competitor. In this case, in spirituality, so often it's the pastor, the priest, our parents, informing those core belief systems that then we operate our entire life. I went inward and I really had this revelation of, oh my gosh, this word trial is effectively akin to the process. It's that time between what Viktor Frankl says, stimulus and response. That time, that moment, that space and time is effectively what it means by that's the process. That's the time that we grow, that we have the moment, we have the power of choice to determine who am I going to be right here, right now, in this moment of time, whether it's brief or long. When we get a diagnosis, we have a stimulus. That's a stimulus. And our response, it's multifaceted. It's an ongoing response. And therefore there's the process. If it's a split second, we get a test grade back. If we get a notice about a client putting in their termination of a contract, whatever the stimulus is, right after the stimulus, that becomes that space and time that is the trial, that is the process, that is the cultivation of our souls. But if we're moving so quickly, and we don't ever take the time to allow that space and allow that pause and thus allow the process, we effectively ruin the potential for the stimulus to really have this full effect that can really change us, that can really cultivate us and make a transformation from the inside out. And so this is what's also so exciting. That real-time process is, in the moment. But going back and revisiting those times in our lives allows for the harvest, where effectively we benefit from these stimuli that Viktor Frankl talks about between stimulus and response as choice. So we benefit from that stimulus in a couple different regards. One is in real time, when we go through that process and that time and space between stimulus and response. That is one core benefit of how we can learn from and glean from the stimuli. The second is to go back in hindsight retroactively and analyze our response and analyze that space. What did I do well? What did I not do well? What could I actually take away and harvest as a lesson for the future? So y'all, this is where, people talk about you have what you need. And I really, there's a part of that sentiment that I really do believe. I really do believe that we have within us so much that has yet to be harvested, so much that we have yet to go inward and really kind of pick the fruit. And y'all, that's ours. We earned that. That's the scars and the stripes and the blood and the sweat and the tears that we have poured out in servitude for others, for ourselves, that maybe we haven't gone back to reap the harvest from. And yeah, we need to do that. You've earned it. I've earned it. And that's honor. That's reverence for all of those experiences in the past, which, I look back, there was a time in my life that I had ignored for so long. And it was actually the day when I got the news that my brother-in-law was killed. It was October 5th, 2014. A year after our 1-year anniversary. I was 21. And I never wanted to revisit that day. And obviously so, right? It was the most devastating day of our lives. And I was watching a movie a couple years ago. I was watching this film, and there's this moment where they're at the graveside, and they're lowering the casket of a young bride. She and her husband had gotten married 4 months earlier, and then she passes away. And they're lowering the casket into the ground, and everyone is just a wreck in this film. And I all of a sudden was taken back to that day. And I realized in that moment, I just started to weep uncontrollably. And I was by myself in my apartment, and I just started to weep. And I heard myself, it was kind of like this out-of-body experience, and I heard myself say, I never called her. And it was this moment in time that I had suppressed and it kept hidden for so long because I had shame intrinsically wrapped around it. And the shame was that when I found out my brother-in-law was killed, I never called my sister. And that, yes, it was devastating hearing the news of him passing, but the real reason why my subconscious suppressed that day and would effectively not allow me to revisit it was because of the shame wrapped around it, given my response. And so when we talk about Viktor Frankl's quote, between stimulus and response is choice, us going back retroactively in history of our own lives and examining those very deeply painful moments with compassion, that compassion, empathy and action working in concert together, that empathy allows for a healing that was never done in the past. It allows for the necessary healing, and it's almost like a balm and an ointment to just let the weeping occur. And also going back and just sitting with that 20-year-old girl who didn't make a right call, who didn't know what to do or say because she attributed her worth in what she could do for people. And because I couldn't do anything for my sister, I decided not to call, rather than understanding that my sister just wanted a physical presence. But I didn't have my worth, my value system structured in a way that worth was attributed to being. My worth was only ever tied to my doing. And thus it was like, what's the point of being there? And so in going back, we give the healing and the empathy so that that part of us can actually heal from that wound. But also, in compassion, we can take action now today to prevent and ensure that that doesn't happen again. The action informs the mindsets that need to shift so that new choices and better choices can be made in a different stimulus and response situation. So as we have more and more spaces, what this biblical text deems as trials, and likened to between stimulus and response as choice, this time and pause in the moment, in real time, this space of time that we get to decide, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? Stopping. I really, man, stopping is so incredibly important in these moments after the stimulus. It's like, just stop and just take a break, take a pause, go inward, and then be informed by your ideal, by who you want to be, to thus direct and orient your choice of the response. Otherwise, we look back on our lives, on the legacy that we're building in real time today, right now. You and I, right now, we're creating a legacy. And the question is, are we proud of the legacy that we're creating? Are we creating a legacy with one that, man, we revere, we honor the time, the inputs, and the people in our lives and the way that we're spending every single day? Because I will never get this day back, and you will never get this day back. And so even with regrets, let's say, I wish I had called my sister that day I found out about my brother-in-law being killed. And by way of going back with compassion, I can heal that moment in my life. I can actually ask for forgiveness, and I have. And I can ensure that I cultivate the muscles and tools and beliefs necessary around my own value of worth, my own being, to then ensure that the next time something like this happens, I can respond differently. But unless we go back and do that compassion work, the empathy and action working in concert, we will never see real change in our lives predicated on the past. And y'all, the past really does hold just a wealth of wisdom, but we have to go back. We have to do the work to ask, who was I? What was that baseline? Where did I start from? And where am I starting from today? What needs to change in order to reach the ideal and become the person that I know that I can be if I only do so with intention?